Spark Books here. Today, I'm going to explain the book, Holy Shit, by Melissa Mohr. Take care, enjoy the book, and have a nice day. Holy Shit, 2013, is a journey through the history of swearing. Starting in ancient Rome and coming up to the present day, these sparks delve into the cultures of different periods to highlight the rich evolution of swear words and obscenities throughout history. Key idea number 1. Roman sailors swore about different topics than modern people. Imagine walking through Pompeii's column-lined streets, preserved over 2,000 years ago. While admiring the ancient Roman architecture and history, you see some vulgar graffiti. The Romans swore, but their most insulting terms were based on their unique view of sex and gender. Romans saw sex as vigorous or passive, not heterosexual or homosexual. Men were active, thus suggesting they were passive in a sexual act was the worst crime. An active male should want to penetrate, regardless of gender. Given this cultural norm, accusing a Roman man of cunum lingerie, or cunnilingus, was the harshest offense. Thus, one Pompeii graffiti says chorus licks cunt. These statements are terrible today, yet they were just as vulgar in Roman times. Cunnilingus was banned because ancient Romans believed that piercing someone was desired and being penetrated was feminine. Thus, a man who could penetrate but chose cunnilingus was embarrassed and considered emasculated. Zoolus, you dirty the bathtub scrubbing your arse, reads a Roman epigram. Zoolus, stick your head in it. Since Zoolus cunnilingus, the speaker claims his mouth is filthy than his bottom. Key idea number 2, the Old Testament popularized religious profanity. The Old Testament used oaths, while ancient Romans slandered people with oral sex charges. Swearing was intended to support claims, not shock and offend. In other words, the Old Testament urges people to take oaths by God to keep society running well. An oath is a vow to God to follow through. He became a witness by swearing by God. Thus, God would guarantee the person's word, enabling all dealings and agreements. Since vows involve God, they must be treated seriously and allude to important topics. Thus, oaths were believed. Vain oaths were wicked and may weaken God's omnipresence. False oaths humiliate God by forcing him to see unfulfilled promises. By God and by God's hands were oaths with the force of expletives. Such statements intensify rather than promise God. These violated the third commandment by defaming God. Key idea number 3, the New Testament forbids euphemisms. The New Testament regulates profane language, while the Old Testament emphasizes oaths. It prohibits profanity and euphemisms to do so. In Song of Songs, my beloved thrust his hand into the aperture, and my inmost being yearned for him. The Old Testament uses euphemistic language. Hand here means genitals, but many academics believe this passage is about God's love for Israel. Jesus condemns euphemistic speech in the New Testament, saying, "On the day of judgment you will have to give an account of every careless word you utter." Jesus believed that words without a beneficial impact were wasteful distractions. The New Testament advises against using needless words, but it does not compare them to language that drives people to do wrong. The apostles believed filthy language led to wicked thoughts and actions. The letter to the Ephesians, which may have been written by Paul, forbids mentioning immorality and impurity. This means Christians must not only avoid wrong behaviors but also avoid saying things that cause people to think unclean ideas, whether sexual or scatological. Key idea number 4, medieval swearing was common, but religious swearing was most powerful. Bollocks, cunt, and whore were typical medieval curses. Back then, body-related words weren't indecent. Latin literature for children often used cunt and arse to describe certain anatomical parts. These novels taught young boys terms like you stink, turd in your teeth, and he is the biggest coward who ever pissed. Since there was no privacy and human bodily functions were not taboo, excrement words were also common. Erasmus, a 16th century scholar, taught across Europe, "It is unpleasant to welcome someone who is urinating or defecating," he said, implying that such actions were common in 1530. In medieval times, taking the Lord's name in vain was an obscenity that shocked and offended. By God's bones was a common expression used to emphasize statements. False swearing, along with vain swearing, was regarded the worst sin. Medieval oaths guaranteed political and legal relationships. Thus, a person could be acquitted of a crime by compurgation, finding enough individuals to swear by his innocence. False swearing was the worst offense since vows were so powerful. Key idea number 5, Renaissance obscenities included excrement. Swearing became more profane as Protestantism spread across Europe and swears lost their power to startle and offend. Protestants believe God is immaterial and cannot be touched. Thus, oaths could not directly reach God and lost their perceived effectiveness. The sheer number of vows necessary devalued swearing by God. Feudalism's decline and capitalism's emergence accelerated this cultural transition. Since capitalism self-regulates honesty, networks no longer needed vows. Promises and contracts replaced oaths when respectability became economically valuable. As a result, profanity gained strength. The privy, a private space, was invented in the 16th century. A sereverence, a fancy phrase meaning turd could be left in a privy. This euphemism combines save and reverence to apologize before an inappropriate statement. The growth in physical seclusion created figurative walls between individuals and embarrassed them at the sight or discussion of bodily functions, which was not the case in the Middle Ages. Interestingly, such incidents only embarrassed people of equal or higher social position. Thus, you could discuss poop with a lower-class person. Key idea number 6, even the word leg was prohibited for Victorians. Victorians in 19th century Britain swore differently as industrialization spread across the West. The middle and lower classes were becoming more civilized, making sexuality and defecation embarrassing for everyone. Thus, bodily acts that were once conducted openly were now hidden behind closed doors that the population could now afford. Thus, restroom time became taboo and invisible. To avoid words like shit and spit, the language was Latinized to defecate and expectorate. These terms from the dead language of well-educated individuals were regarded more sophisticated. As careful speech signified status, even typical bodily parts became unmentionable. In Victorian society, polished language was linked with the higher class, while more straightforward terms, considered bad language, were connected with the illiterate lower class. Thus, profanity was associated with ignorance and the inability to communicate. The middle class avoided forbidden topics to differentiate itself from the lower class. Even mentioning bodily parts in polite speech could have been a mistake. In polite society, the word trousers was taboo because removing one's pants revealed one's upper body. Limb was chosen over leg, which was taboo. After limb became offensive, it was renamed lower extremity. Key idea number 7, as Victorians used obscenity figuratively, they became swear words. Modern swear words emerged from Victorian linguistic repression. These were emotive obscenities. Bugger was common. Over time, it became a swear word from an obscenity that referred to the penetrating party in anal communication. Today, buggered over means messed up, not literally. This term was printed as BGGR and was spoken by 4/5 of the British population. Because of its non-literal meaning, it had become a less offensive way of saying fuck, which was not authorized in print as F.K. Bugger was one of the oaths popular during this time. Another was bloody, which was initially used as a metaphor. Swearing becomes increasingly common to modern audiences because words like this strengthened those who followed. In 1836, Mary Hamilton called some women bloody whores. She meant whores, not bloody. Fuck became its contemporary form. In 1790, Virginian Judge George Tucker wrote a poem in which a son fights with his father, who replies, G.D., your books. I wouldn't give dash for all you've read. The first known use of I don't give a fuck was the second phrase. Key idea number 8, racial insults are now the most offensive terms. Swearing was so common in the military during the First and Second World Wars that fuck was barely noticed. A collection of First World War slang phrases says that fucking signified a shell or attack was incoming. Because of its frequency, grab your guns was more urgent than fucking. Swearing frequently and sexually reduces its impact. By the turn of the 21st century, movies, internet, books, television, magazines, and other media with sexual themes were no longer forbidden. Thus, people contemplate and talk about sex constantly, whether in person, on TV, or through pornographic media. Newsstands sell regular periodicals with explicit content. However, some words are still offensive, like cunt. With ordinary swear words losing their power, racial insults have become insulting and violent. The N-word, first used in 1574 to describe to dark-skinned Africans, has become a derogatory term that offends all nationalities. Thus, the N-word causes hurt, fury, and violent retaliation. North Carolina District Attorney Jerry Spivey was fired after being overheard at a pub stating, "Look at that N-word, banging on my wife." This disgusting epithet broke the peace and incited violence, making it unforgivable. David Howard lost his job after telling his colleagues to act niggardly with their budget because money was limited. This word comes from niggard, which meant frugal 200 years before the insult it resembles. Swear words have an extensive history. Modern obscenities often stem from centuries-old social, religious, and economic norms. To view more content like this, subscribe. Don't forget to like and turn on notifications. The channel really benefits from it. I appreciate you being here.